Hi everyone, we're going to do a video today on the endocrine system. This is going to be an overview of the endocrine system, all the major glands, the hormones they produce, and some of those basic functions of the hormones. We're going to start with the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Be sure to watch my video on the hypothalamus and pituitary connection. It's going to be a lot more specific as to how those two glands work. But again, today's going to be just a basic overview. So we'll start out again, the hypothalamus. Main thing to know here is that there's really, you could say, two sets of hormones. You've got your regulatory hormones. Regulatory hormones, which are always going to be referred to as either inhibiting or releasing hormones. Okay, and to be specific, there are a total of 6 inhibiting and releasing hormones. Now, I'm not going to give you the specific names of all 6. Of course, you could look those up very easily, but the key is, and this is kind of the secret, if you're studying the endocrine system, is that they will all have the name inhibiting or releasing within them. Okay, the abbreviation will have an I or an R in the middle of it, like gonadotropin releasing hormone, that's GnRH. So you notice the name releasing in there. That helps you identify that it's a hypothalamic hormone. Now, the only exception to that is growth hormone inhibiting hormone is typically called somatostatin. So if you see that one is growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So just a little trick for that. Now, the other type, or other set, I guess you'd say, which are more from neuroendocrine based cells, would be ADH and oxytocin. Okay. The inhibiting and releasing hormones are going to do just that. They're going to go to the anterior pituitary and either inhibit or release hormones down there. Okay. And that's all we're really going to say about those right now. If you want more detail on that, obviously watch the other video. Now, ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. So this one's going to be water retention. Okay. Oxytocin has a whole bunch of effects, both the male and the female. You know, the big ones, of course, in the female are going to be labor contractions. And, you know, the other big one's going to be milk ejection during pregnancy. Obviously, those are female related. In the male, which also the female as well, but in the male, it is involved dealing with the sexual response. So there are many functions to oxytocin, but these are some big ones that most anatomy textbooks talk about. So that's really it for hypothalamus that we're going to talk about. Now, if we go down to the pituitary, which obviously the hypothalamus is directly connected to it. Okay, we've got, of course, our anterior side and our posterior side. The anterior and posterior side are completely separate. It's one gland, but they're functionally separate. Let me do the posterior side first, and then we can erase it. You should know from the other video that it simply stores ADH and oxytocin. Out of there. That's all it does. It stores and then, of course, releases as we need it, ADH and oxytocin. So we don't really have to say much more about the posterior side. Okay. Now, anterior side, like we said, is very different. I'm going to put a bunch of abbreviations here. There are a total of 6 hormones again produced in the anterior pituitary. These 6 are going to be either inhibited or released based on these 6 inhibiting and releasing hormones up here in the hypothalamus. So picture these hormones traveling down a portal system to either, again, inhibit or release these 6 in the anterior pituitary. Okay, so that's very important to understand. Let me give them to you here. We've got FSH and LH. So we'll talk about with these two in a minute. TSH, ACTH, prolactin, and growth hormone. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's all FSH and LH. We're just going to say stimulates the gonads. That would be our ovaries and testes. So they stimulate ovaries and testes, and they're going to stimulate them to do a few things. One big thing in particular is, of course, release testosterone and release estrogen and progesterone. So two big things here. Obviously, TSH stimulates the thyroid. ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex. Okay. Prolactin literally means makes milk. Pro, right, for, and then lactin's milk. So it makes milk, obviously, during pregnancy and during nursing. And then, of course, growth hormone stimulates cellular growth. Simple as that. Okay? That's our entire hypothalamus and pituitary. Again, if you want more details on how it all works, you got to watch the other video. So moving on, we're going to go to another very important gland. Working down our list. Let me say this about these as well. If you're wondering what category these fall in, there's three major categories to our hormones. Those all just fell under the peptide category. Okay, so if you're kind of keeping track or need to keep track of that, it's either going to be monoamines or amines, whatever you want to call them, peptides, or steroids. So those all fell under the peptide category. Okay. Next one we're going to talk about is going to be the thyroid gland. Okay. Thyroid. Either you're going to have follicular cells or you're going to have parafollicular cells. The follicular cells make T3 and T4. Okay, that's what are typically referred to as thyroid hormones. The 3 and the 4 refer to the iodine atoms that are in the T3 and in the T4. This is triiodothyronine. So that literally means 3 iodines, right? Triiodothyronine. And this one's referred to as thyroxine. So what do these do? All you got to know in a nutshell is that these regulate your metabolic rate, right? These are elevated, you're going to have a more rapid metabolic rate. These are depressed, you're going to have just that depressed metabolic rate or slower metabolic rate. So these regulate your metabolic rate. What about the parafollicular cells? They make one hormone called calcitonin. We'll do another video on calcium homeostasis, calcium balance. Calcitonin is one of those hormones that regulates calcium homeostasis. So what is it going to do? It basically lowers calcium levels. Right? When we're talking calcium levels, we're talking about lowers the level of calcium in the bloodstream. Okay? It lowers it, and it's basically, if you think about it this way, it's going to literally take calcium from the bloodstream, i.e. lowering it, and using that calcium to build bone. Okay, so it's going to have the effect of lowering calcium levels and basically because it stimulates osteoblasts. And if you know about anything about osteoblasts, these guys basically build bone. Okay, they create the osteocytes. Okay, so that really is our nutshell. Thyroid is considered only an endocrine gland. It doesn't have really any other function, so it ends up being considered the largest endocrine gland in the body. So a little tidbit of info here. T3, T4 are amines or monoamines, however you want to term them there. Calcitonin is a peptide. Okay, so just giving you those categories of hormones again. So again, T3, T4 is a monoamine. T3, T4 is also hydrophobic. So a little tidbit there under the monoamine category. It is hydrophobic. All peptides are hydrophilic. Okay. Next one is the parathyroid gland. Makes only one hormone, PTH. What does that stand for? Parathyroid hormone. So it's actually one of those hormones that actually has a good name. It actually makes sense. Parathyroid hormone made by the parathyroid gland. So what does this one do? This one is the antagonist to calcitonin. does the exact opposite function that calcitonin did. So we were just talking about calcitonin, right? It lowered calcium levels, which means this one has to raise blood calcium levels. So when our calcium levels are low, which actually is a fairly common problem, people have hypocalcemia, they have low or deficient calcium levels, what's going to happen? PTH is going to be secreted to raise the blood calcium levels back up. What does it do? It actually robs the bone to raise calcium levels. So what's it going to do? It's going to stimulate the opposite cell. It's going to stimulate the osteoclast, okay, which is basically a macrophage. It's a bone resorbing cell. Okay, so remember, PTH is another calcium homeostasis hormone. Okay, PTH would fall under the peptide category as well. Peptides are a very big category. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about the pancreas. Pancreas has two really important hormones. Many of you guys might already be familiar with the pancreas. Are insulin and glucagon. So we could also call these antagonists, okay? This one comes from the alpha cell. This one would be beta cell of the pancreas. These cells are referred to as islets of Langerhans or pancreatic islet cells. That's kind of a newer term. So under that pancreatic islet cell is the alpha and the beta. So again, the alpha makes glucagon, the beta makes insulin. Okay, and basically what does insulin do? It's going to lower blood sugar levels. So we'll put blood glucose. Okay, so basically you eat a meal, right? During the meal and immediately after the meal, your blood sugar is gonna rise, and it's gonna be insulin that's gonna be secreted to lower it back down, to try to keep it at normal levels. Glucagon is going to do the exact opposite then. It's going to raise blood glucose levels. So when is glucagon going to be secreted? It's going to be secreted during times of fasting. So I'm in between meals. It's been, let's say, 3-4 hours, all throughout the night when I'm fasting. Glucagon is going to be secreted to keep blood sugar levels elevated and to, of course, prevent them from crashing. Okay, so the whole idea is that these two work basically together, opposite functions, but working together to regulate blood sugar. We don't want sky-high blood sugar levels, which obviously is not good for our body. We don't want blood sugar crashes, which is also not good for our body and going to make us feel really, really terrible. So that's our function for our pancreatic hormones. Under the pancreas, we're going to put these in the peptide category or protein category again. Okay, again, when I say peptide, I'm referring to essentially the proteins as well. Okay, so we'll just say that they're under the peptide category. Let's talk about adrenals next. Your adrenals are located right on top of the kidneys. You've got 2 kidneys, so you've got 2 adrenal glands. When we talk about adrenals, we really talk about 2 parts. We talk about the inner part, which is referred to as the adrenal medulla, and then we also have the outer portion, which we refer to as the cortex. So under the adrenal medulla, we will have 2 main hormones produced, and that would be epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, these fall under the category we call of neurotransmitters called catecholamines. Under the hormone category, these are going to be a monoamine. Okay, they're going to be a hydrophilic monoamine. Okay, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Easiest thing to do is that they really are stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system. If you think about it that way, and the sympathetic nervous system is really what's responsible for our fight or flight response. So the easiest way to think of this is think of the fight or flight response. What happens when our body undergoes a fight or flight response? Fight or flight basically means we're either going to fight for our lives or run for our lives. So in that instance, what's happening? Our heart rate's increasing, our respirations are increasing, our blood flow's increasing, and things like digestion and waste elimination are being depressed or restricted. So that is what epinephrine and norepinephrine do, is they basically stimulate that fight or flight response. And they stimulate all those systems that basically the fight or flight response would basically ramp up. So think about it that way. Just think of fight or flight. The adrenal cortex, on the other hand, is going to make a list of steroids. So again, this is a monoamine, but the cortex makes steroids. So that's another class of hormones we haven't gotten to yet. So our steroids, many of them come from the adrenal cortex. So what are some examples of the adrenal cortex that we're going to talk about? Really, I'm going to give you one from each part of the cortex. So one is going to be aldosterone. Okay. One is going to be cortisol. And this is going to be in the outermost portion of the cortex. Middle portion of the cortex is cortisol. And then the innermost portion of the cortex is going to be testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. Okay, so we can see that we're going to just refer to these as the sex steroids. Okay. And obviously, we're going to do another video on testosterone and estrogen and progesterone. We're going to do one on the reproductive system. We're going to talk about the whole entire female cycle and also the endocrinology of the male. So we're going to do a lot more on that right now. But obviously, this is the male hormone, which is going to be responsible for all the male features. Obviously, this is integral in making sperm production. We'll talk more about that down the road. Obviously, estrogen and progesterone are the female hormones. Okay. Responsible for regulating the female cycle, particularly the uterine cycle or menstrual cycle, whatever you want to call it. All the feminizing features of the female are controlled by estrogen. So we'll talk more about that down the road. Cortisol is a steroid as well. We're just going to refer to it as stress hormone. Easiest way to think about it, it helps your body cope with stress. Okay. Aldosterone has a blood pressure raising effect, integral hormone in raising blood pressure. And we're going to do a whole discussion on that down the road as well, our angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. It raises blood pressure by retaining sodium and excreting potassium. So that's aldosterone's function, retaining sodium, excreting potassium. Okay. Again, also a steroid. Okay. So that's what we find in the adrenal cortex. Now, moving on, just a couple more to talk about here real quickly. Obviously, our larger sex steroids, or larger amounts, are obviously in the gonads, and that would be our testes and ovaries. And it's really the same hormones I just referred to. There's an O there. We've got our testosterone. Make sure I spell it right. There we go. And of course, our estrogen and progesterone. So already discussed them, but obviously the gonads produce the majority of testosterone for the male and estrogen and progesterone for the female, not the adrenal cortex. They obviously secrete a much smaller amount. But yes, it is true that, for instance, the female does produce a little testosterone, the male produces a little estrogen. Okay, obviously we've got opposite amounts. That female has a lot more estrogen than a male does, and the male has a lot more testosterone than the female does, but we both do produce it. Now, another small gland in the brain we're going to talk about is this pineal gland. Okay, what does it make? It makes melatonin. Melatonin is produced from a hormone called serotonin, which many of you guys I'm sure have heard of. Melatonin is a unique little hormone. Tiny little gland. This gland shrinks as we get older. Around teenage years, this gland shrinks quite a bit. It is a monoamine. Okay. okay, this melatonin. And it has the opposite function of serotonin. So basically, what does melatonin do? It basically helps you fall asleep. It's secreted at night in the dark, and it's designed to help you fall asleep. Okay, which means it's the opposite function of serotonin. What's serotonin going to do? Serotonin is secreted during daylight and helps you wake up. Okay, but only melatonin is going to be produced here in the pineal gland. Last but not least, we're going to talk about the thymus. Again, don't get that confused with the thyroid. This is thymus, which is hidden behind the sternum. It's quite large in an infant. It's quite large, literally larger than a heart in an infant, but then it begins to shrink as the child gets older. In an adult, it's quite small. So it's significant shrinking again as the child gets older. One main hormone I'm going to give you here is this thymosin. It actually makes some thymulin as well, but I'm just going to give you this hormone, thymosin, which is related to T cell maturation. T cell maturation. So it is involved in the maturing of T cells, and that's basically what happens inside the thymus. Its job is to allow for the maturing of the T lymphocyte cell. Okay, and obviously because it involves T cells, it's considered a part of the lymphatic system. Okay, yes, it's endocrine, but it's also part of the lymphatic system. So that's a quick rundown on endocrinology. A lot of students have a difficult time with the endocrine system. It doesn't have to be hard. It's a matter of just understanding all the glands, what they produce, and their basic function. Okay, last but not least, this is a peptide. So again, 3 categories of hormones. If you didn't notice already, the steroid, the peptide, and the monoamine. So I gave you categories for each. Endocrine can be an easy study chapter. It just takes a little time. So good luck and good study.